Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 45th Hands-on Agile meetup. I'm very excited that today we have a special guest, James Shaw. He is a prolific writer on Agile software development. If you don't know the book, please read it. It is essential. I really enjoy the book and a lot of good things and thoughts, ideas, practices. This is what you need to know if you're working in this industry. And he's also the co-creator of the Agile Fluency Model in collaboration with Diana Larsen, by the way, who will speak in 2 weeks' time from now. So I'm really happy that James found some time to join us here today. And he will be talking about FAST, the new way to, air quotes, scale Agile. James, what is it all about?
Thanks, Stefan. Well, as mentioned, I'm James Shore. I've been practicing Agile for over 20 years. I started out with extreme programming. Along the way, wrote the book that Stefan mentioned. It's actually out in a second edition now. It has a goldfish on the cover, which makes it better. It's actually more or less completely rewritten. So check it out if you haven't seen it. I think it's pretty good, although I am a little biased. I have been helping companies scale. I like that you put that in air quotes, scale, for the last 12, 13 years. And I'm here to tell you about the most promising approach to scaling I've yet seen. We're going to have time for questions. So let's start out and talk about what do I mean by scaling? There's a bunch of different things that people often talk about when they say scaling. One of them is just teaching Agile or getting people to be Agile across an organization. And that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is adding people to a single product or set of related products so that you have multiple teams who depend on each other to get their work done. In other words, no one team can do their work on their own. You have multiple interdependent teams. And scaling is important because, of course, if you want to deliver sooner, the number one way to deliver sooner is not to scale, it's to reduce scope. But the second way to deliver sooner is to eliminate waste. And the third way you can deliver fast is to improve technical capacity and capability. And way down the list is scaling. And for that reason, the real title of this talk should be Scaling, the Last Thing You Want to Do. I'm joking, but not entirely. I see companies reach for scaling as sort of their only tool in their toolbox when they want stuff to come out the door sooner. But scaling isn't a silver bullet. It's not easy. It's got real costs and challenges associated with it. And it can tank your ability to deliver. I've seen organizations reach for scaling, add a bunch of people quickly, and ruin the intrinsic knowledge in their organization and ruin their ability to deliver because they now introduce so many delays and errors in those coordination across interdependent teams. So when I say that I've been helping companies scale for the last 12, 13 years, actually what's happening is typically they've already scaled, they've already added people, but they're struggling. The most common thing I used to see, and actually the most common thing I still see today, is what people call component teams. This is where each team is focused on a particular technical part of the system. I'm sure you've seen this. If you've seen a front-end team and a back-end team, you've seen a component team approach. But you'll also see the database team or the ops team. People who are focused on specific technical areas, those are component teams. People hired me to help them because their work was grinding to a halt. And I actually have one example in particular I'm going to use throughout this talk, or at least the first part of this talk. They reached out to me. They had about 200 engineers, 300 people in the development organization, 42 teams, and they wanted me to help them because their work was grinding to a halt. And this is really common when people come to me for help with scaling. It's because they can't deliver. And so I did a value stream map with this organization. A value stream map is when you look at the progression of initial idea turning into delivered software. What steps does that go through? And where is work being done? And where is it waiting? Or is there other forms of waste? And so I did a value stream map for this company and on a couple of their teams, a couple of their ideas. And what we found was that they had something like 97% wait or waste time. They were spending 2 to 3 days of work on something that would take several months to deliver. And this is really common because when you have component teams, if you have a front end, a back end team, maybe a database team, in the simple example, then anytime that you want to deliver anything, all of those teams have to coordinate. And so what was happening in this organization is a team would start working on something, they would need another team to do something, they would hand off, and then they would wait. And while they were waiting, they would take on other work. They would work on another thing. They're not just sitting around twiddling their thumbs. And so when a team came to them saying, we need something from you, they said, sorry, we're in the middle of something. And that team would wait. And the whole thing just sort of got bound up into gridlock. So these companies are getting killed by their cross-team dependencies. And they're also seeing that when you wait like that, when you hand something off to another team, there tends to be a lot of errors associated with that. So here's an example. This is at that company with 42 teams. I got representatives from every team into a big room, and we created this diagram over the course of several hours. We affectionately called this the spaghetti diagram. Every card, every box that you see here represents a team. Every line represents a dependency between teams, where dependency is defined as this team cannot finish its work unless the team they depend on does something for them. That's the spaghetti diagram. And that's really common. Now, this was a extreme case, but even when I'm dealing with, small, large scale systems of maybe 6 or 7 teams, you still see this sort of behavior. So what I did was I helped them redefine their team responsibilities. We called those teams, the ideal that we were looking for, we called them full ownership teams. But lately, there's a book that came out, I think a few years ago, called Team Topologies, which popularized the term stream-aligned teams, which is the same thing. The idea here is that you want to create teams that can completely own a particular segment of the market. Some people call them feature teams. And so we did that and it worked. It resolved the bottlenecks, it allowed the company to keep growing. And they got up to about 67 teams before they started running into new problems, which were mostly around product management. But it still wasn't perfect. In a stream-aligned team, what you're doing is you're having each team focus on to use the team topologies definition, each team focuses on a continuous flow of work aligned to a business domain or organizational capability. But their typical organization, the teams can only be sort of Amazon's famous 2-pizza team, 5 to 7 folks. And that's not enough for each team to truly own a significant portion of the final product. So you still do end up with dependencies between the teams. It's also really hard to incorporate specialties such as user experience and security and ops. In this organization, after the redesign, we had 40 teams. They had 10 user experience folks, and they had 3 security folks. That's not enough to have one on every team. Now, this was actually an ops-oriented company, so they did have lots of SREs, which was what their ops folks were, their site reliability engineers. But we couldn't get specialties on every team, and that was a source of problems. It also turned out to be brittle to changing business strategy. It was a lot of work to come up with this new design. We tried to do it in a really inclusive way, but we still had to form a change team of engineers and managers from a cross-section of the company to lead this change. And that took several months of design work and talking to people. But over time, the needs of the organization change. And so how much effort you want to put into any given thing changes, which means the sizes of the teams have to change. And as teams grow and shrink, you need to change which teams are responsible for what and how the teams are relating to each other. That turns out to be hard. We actually defined an architecture team, the existing architecture team. We said that part of your job is to maintain the structure of the organization. You may have heard of Conway's Law. The structure of the organization reflects the structure of the code. We were doing the reverse Conway maneuver, which is we were designing the structure of the organization so that we had the right structure for the code. So it was the architecture team's responsibility to keep track of this, keep on top of it. But the fact is, they didn't. It's not something you have to do every day. So over time, as the organization needs drifted, by the time the architecture team needed to do something, they had forgotten that that was their responsibility, or they were in the middle of other things. And even if they had, remember, it's still a challenge to change these teams around as your business strategy changes. Another thing that I found as I talked to these folks later was that it leads to silos. Each team is responsible for a small part of the overall product, and they have as much responsibility for that part of the product as we can give them, which is good because it gives them a lot of autonomy. But what that means is that they are now more focused on that than the overall success of the entire suite and portfolio of products. And so what this organization found is when they wanted to do big cross-team, cross-product initiatives, it was hard for them to succeed at that. And cross-team dependencies were still a challenge. It was better, but the fact is when you've got teams of 5 to 10 people, you simply cannot have truly autonomous teams. You still need other types of teams. Team topology talks about enabling teams and other types of teams. And that's what we had to do as well. So we had a lot of questions from the beginning of this new design about how do we deal with dependencies. So I was very happy with this approach. I had been helping people with it for years, but it wasn't perfect. I was looking for other alternatives, ways to make it better. And in 2019, I heard about FAST from Ron Cortell and Paige Watson at the Agile Open Northwest Conference in Oregon, US. FAST stands for Fluid Scaling Technology. And it's about combining open space technology, which is a tool for self-organizing in conferences, with frequent opportunities to change teams. And when I first heard about this, I had the same reaction that I did to extreme programming. My first reaction was, wow, this is really brilliant. This is super interesting, but I don't know if it could possibly work. So I've got to try it. And the reason I was so interested in this is because in the team topologies approach, the approach I've been using for over a decade, what we're doing is we're scaling horizontally. We're adding people by adding new teams, preferably autonomous teams who can own a part of the market or the product. So that's horizontal scaling. We're adding more teams. In the FAST approach, we're scaling vertically. We're adding people by having more people participate in one virtual team. FAST calls it a collective, having more people act as a single team. The thing about the horizontal scaling approach is that it requires careful design. When I do this, I do it as egalitarian, as involving as many people as possible, getting as much input as possible. But ultimately, we're talking about making a big design change to the organization and potentially reflecting that in the architecture. It's a lot of work and ultimately has to be done in kind of a top-down way. I do pull in a cross-section of the organization to do this work, and they go out and have a constituency that they work with, but it's still sort of top-down. It's centrally managed, and it has to be done in kind of a big bang way because we're looking at changing the whole organization. That's not really what the spirit of Agile is all about. The spirit of Agile is self-organized and bottom-up and incremental. And I saw that as a flaw of the way I was doing scaling, but I couldn't see an opportunity to improve it. But when I heard about FAST, I thought, yes, this is something that's completely about self-organization. It is bottom up, and it is something we can do incrementally. This is really interesting. This is in the spirit of Agile. I want to try it out. I have experience with self-organization as part of this scaling work that I do. This is a picture from a self-organization event at that company where we redesigned 40 teams. So we did that work. We did lots of communication about what the design is going to be. Got a lot of feedback, came up with a design, and then to put it into place, we meet in a big room, which is what the picture here shows. Each table represents a team. The large white balloons have the name of the team written on them, which I've blanked out for confidentiality purposes. And each team has a description of what its responsibilities are, what kinds of skills are needed on that team, who's going to be the product owner or technical product owner for that team. And then people walk around, they talk to folks, and they choose a team to join. I've done this several times. I do it whenever my customers will allow it, which is actually surprisingly often. And it works really well at getting people aligned and eager to work together from the beginning. Although there's often some fear about, am I going to be picked last? They don't realize that they're choosing, they're not being picked. You're not allowed to say, no, you can't join this team in this self-organizing approach. So I have a lot of experience with self-organization. I know that works. I also have experience with open space technology, the conference technique, and I know that works really well. So I thought the core ideas here around FAST, they're very different and they're very weird. And I don't know if this could work, but I have to try it. And then 2 years went by. I talked about it. I even put it in the book. There's this chapter on scaling in the book, and I talked about vertical scaling and horizontal scaling. There's a more mainstream approach to vertical scaling called LESS, large scale Scrum, which I do recommend. But in the book, I said, I haven't tried FAST, but wow, this is really interesting. And if you want to be on the cutting edge, give it a try. But I didn't have a chance to try it myself. And then last year, I was asked to help a company design its teams because they were trying to move from having independent, isolated solo developers to working in teams. Now, this company has over 100,000 employees. It's a big healthcare organization in the US, dozens, probably hundreds of hospitals and clinics. But I have to be honest with you. If you hear a consultant, and I'm sorry to say I am a consultant, if you hear a consultant say, oh, I worked for a company with 100,000 people, whatever, ask them how many they worked with directly. Because I wasn't working with a whole organization. Most people don't work with a whole organization at once. I was working with a single department. This department had 45 people. So that's really the level of scale we're talking about, is 45 people, 13 product managers, 24 engineers, 5 executives, which is kind of an interesting ratio. It's a lot of product managers and executives for a fairly small number of engineers. And the reason for that is partly because they were a data analytics department and it was very domain intensive. They had to have a lot of understanding of medicine and what was happening medically with the visualizations they were creating. And it was also sort of a classic IT organization in that they had a lot of stakeholders who were asking for a lot of different things. So the product management was necessary to manage all that. Now, I was originally planning to do a classic horizontal scaling, team topology style scaling approach with them because that's what I knew. I knew how to make it work. And I didn't think they'd have the appetite for anything radical. But then I saw this. This was something we created as part of our initial work together. Every square on this diagram is a product that they were responsible for. The circles are groups of products that they were responsible for. And every arrow is a dependency between products. And I thought, holy moly, this is not a good fit for a horizontal scaling approach. They have way too many dependencies, way too many products. And we did not have the ability to cut back on the number of products, although I wish they would have. So I thought, well, maybe a vertical scaling approach would be better here after all. So I helped them design a horizontal approach because I knew we needed to see the two ideas side by side. And this is what they came up with. They had 7 teams. Each square is a team. I've taken off the names for confidentiality reasons. Each of the red arrows is a hard dependency so that this team cannot get its work done unless this team does some work for them. And the dashed arrows are soft dependencies. So obviously this was not a great design. It was rife with dependencies. There were too many teams for the size of the organization. Remember, they only had 24 engineers. 7 teams as not a good fit for that number of engineers. And in fact, they were putting the majority of the engineers on one team, and then the rest only had like 1 or 2 engineers. So it just wasn't a good design. It was a recipe for bottlenecks and stress. So we talked about using a vertical scaling approach instead, where people self-select onto teams according to their skills, interests, personal relationships, and the needs of the organization. And the change team that I had helped create looked very carefully at the options, the pros and cons of the horizontal approach, the pros and cons of the vertical approach, and they decided to try it. So let me explain more about FAST, what it is and how it works. In the words of the FAST guide, which you can find at fastagile.io at this URL on the screen, FAST is a lightweight, simple to understand, and simple to master method for organizing people around work that scales. To summarize, what you're going to do is you're going to bring every few days, you're going to bring everybody together to work as one collective. I don't know if that's the best name, but it's the best we've got so far. You're going to visually represent your business goals on a wall. You're going to let the collective self-organize into teams to break down and do that work. And then on a short cadence, again, every couple of days, you're going to synchronize and repeat. So you have the opportunity to form new teams every couple of days. The way we did it was we set aside Wednesday for meetings and self-improvement. And so our FAST cycles were Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, Friday. So we had a FAST meeting on Monday morning and on Thursday morning. So twice a week, there was the opportunity to form teams. People hear this and they think, oh, this is a recipe for chaos. We're going to be forming new teams every 2 days. That can't possibly work. The fact is that people have the opportunity to change teams, but they don't necessarily actually change teams every couple of days. And I'll show you a diagram that shows how people move around or moved around in this environment. Now, the main activity of FAST is that FAST meeting. So every couple of days, you gather everybody together. And we were virtual, so we did this online using Miro, which is a whiteboarding tool. First, Each team summarizes what's happened since the last FAST meeting, sort of like a stand-up, just a very brief couple of sentences. This is what we've been working on, just to keep everybody up to speed on what's going on. Next, product management reviews the current business goals for the FAST collective. In this company, in our department, it was one of the department executives. Usually the business goals haven't changed much, but if something has been finished, they'll talk about, here's what we want to do next. Next, people volunteer to lead teams. These people are called team stewards, and it's a temporary role that only lasts until the next FAST meeting, so only a couple of days. And anybody can volunteer to steward a team. Although in our environment, we said it needed to be an engineer because there were so many product managers that the engineers were being sidelined. And so we wanted to establish more engineering leadership in the organization. So we said the stewards had to be engineers. But as written, anybody can steward a team in FAST. The stewards each say, I want to form a team to work on this thing. And typically that will be related to one of the business priorities of the organization, but it actually can include unlisted but important work, such as refactoring or automation, a spike to understand some technology. Anything that the steward thinks is important to help move the organization forward is something that they can say, I want to form a team to work on this thing. And then everybody decides which team they want to join. In a physical environment, they physically walk over to the team they want to join. In a virtual environment, they drag a sticker with their name on it over to the team that they want to join. And they do that based on their knowledge, their interests, their personalities, and what's best for the organization. And then after that, each team works as they see fit for 2 days or however long your FAST cycle is. It's up to you. They actually experimented with going to 1-week cycles, but decided to go back down to 2 days because they liked the flexibility it gave them. Now, that 1 week or 2 days or however long it is, it's not a sprint. It's not an iteration. It's not a time box. Well, it is a time box, but it's not a commitment. You don't say, I'm going to work on this thing and get this done. You just say, my team is going to work on this thing and make as much progress as we can. This is a continuous flow environment like Kanban, not an iteration-based or sprint-based environment like Scrum and Extreme Programming. So you work for a couple of days, you make as much progress on the thing that you've chosen for your team to do, and then 2 days later, you reconvene and you do it again. I want to show you what our Miro board looked like. This is how we actually organized our FAST meetings. This is the previous iteration. We called it iterations. That was a mistake in retrospect. We should have called it cycle because that's the official FAST term for it. Using the term iteration brought a lot of baggage along it with it for the people who were participating. They really thought that that meant we have to sign up and finish something every 2 days. And that put a lot of stress on them. We had to keep repeating, you're not making a commitment to finish this in the next 2 days. You're just saying, this is what we're going to work on, and we're going to make as much progress as we can in the next 2 days. Anyway, so the top had the previous cycle. The bottom has the current cycle. And that's where most of the action happens in the FAST meeting. At the top of that board, we had our working agreements for the collective. We had the business priorities that we were focused on. And then we had the teams. And each box here is a team. This right here is a collection of stickies that each one had somebody's name on it, which I've removed for confidentiality reasons. And then when people joined a team, they would physically drag their sticky onto the team they wanted to join, which you can see has already been done in this picture. So let's take a closer look at the team box. Now, we had sort of an overcomplicated environment. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So right here, you have, this is what the team is going to be focusing on. This is the team steward. These are the team members who have decided to join this team. It's entirely voluntary. Nobody tells you which team you're going to join. You just choose for yourself based on what your area of expertise is, what you want to learn, perhaps, where you think your help is needed, who you want to work with, what the team's working on, and so forth. These pieces right here, the team focus, the steward, and the team members, that's all you need. They added a little bit more. If you're going to try this yourself, I would not start with. They added a section for which valuable increment is this team working on. And that's because they had a lot of work in progress. Valuable increment is something that we can actually ship and deliver, and the organization was going to get value from delivering. I used to call them minimum marketable features. Some people call them epics, but epic is sort of just means big. And so that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about something that can be delivered and brings value no matter how big it is. They put the valuable increment on there because they had a lot of valuable increments in flight at once. So they needed a way of sort of keeping track. They also had these small maintenance items because previously they had been working in silos, and each engineer sort of had their collection of products that they were responsible for. There was some maintenance work, running reports and so forth, cleaning data that only one person knew how to do for, different people for different things, but only one person knew how to do it. So the teams would form, and then any maintenance that needed to be done during that next 2 days, that cycle, would be assigned to the team that had the person who could do it. And the idea was that that person was going to do it with their team and teach them how to do it so they could start to spread that knowledge out. And there was also some plans to make valuable increments to automate these things. I don't know if either of those things ever happened, which would be unfortunate, but understandable. So that's what the team area looked like. This is the business priorities area. And this, again, I think was overcomplicated. This organization had a lot of challenges. They had a really high ratio of product managers to engineers. They had some kind of rule-oriented thinking, especially by the product managers, sort of spell everything out for me instead of let's just work in good faith to make things work. And in particular, there was kind of a zero-sum mentality, again, particularly on the part of the product managers. This is my product. I need it to succeed. And that often means somebody else has to fail. So very oriented towards let's make my thing succeed at the cost of everybody else. So we had to put a lot of structure around this that I wouldn't recommend that you use yourself. So let's go through it. This is a pull system. When something is complete, you pull a new thing in. So we go from left to right. When something is complete in the past cycle, since the last fast meeting, it would go in the complete box. We had this wrapping up area, which just means that the work is still in progress, but it means the engineering work is done. And now we're going to go back and talk to our stakeholders, get their feedback, and before we put it into production. That could take a couple of weeks in this organization. So although I prefer not to have a wrapping up section, I just keep things in progress until they're done. For this organization, they felt that that was important. The in progress portion, we had the ability to work on 8 valuable increments at once. That's not what I would recommend for most people starting out. I would recommend having the whole collective focus on one valuable increment. Maybe you've got the valuable increment you're wrapping up and the one you're starting. Then you've got the list of valuable increments that are ready to start. So that's what's on deck to happen next. Nothing wrong with that. Although, again, probably would keep it to just a couple, depending on how long they take you. Then they had this blocked section. This is work that had been started, needed feedback from stakeholders. And again, that stakeholder feedback could take several weeks. So things would get put on the back burner in this blocked section while that feedback would be worked out. And then there was this section called being prepped. This is also work that's in progress. It's work that started figuring out the details of what people want and how it's going to work. The product managers in this organization really had a need to own the things. To be fair, there was a lot of time talking to stakeholders, going back and forth. That could, again, take several weeks, even a month or more. So to keep the engineers focused on just the engineering work, there was this being prepped section of the board, which led to some problems in terms of engineers feeling disconnected from the work down the road. So I wouldn't do that either. And then we've already mentioned the small maintenance. So if you're trying this, start out with something simple. Every team is going to need to customize fast to their specific situation, but start with the simplest thing you can. This is what we started with, and then we expanded it to account for the real world needs of the organization. So really all you need to start out with is what you've recently completed, the few things that you have in progress, preferably focusing everybody on 1 or 2 things at once, and what you're going to do next. And then each team, you just need what the team's going to focus on, the steward and the team members, and then one team for as big as the collective is. I would suggest maybe one team for every 4 engineers if you're not using pair programming. You're probably wondering how team switching worked. And because this was all done online, I have a record of who was on each team for the entire history of my time with them. And so I've anonymized that and taken all the names out so that you can see how that actually worked. So what you're going to see here is that each vertical column represents a related stream of work, typically for a single valuable increment. So these two together were one valuable increment. They eventually collapsed that down to just one team working on it. They never got to the point while I was there where they could have multiple teams working on the same valuable increment, which is more about their engineering capability than fast, I think. But this is another valuable increment. This is a valuable increment, and so forth. The new icon means that the work on that valuable increment has started. The checkbox means that the work has been completed and delivered to the point that value is now being received from doing it. You'll see a few that were just abandoned, typically because they started working on it, realized it wasn't a good idea, and stopped working on it. More often, you'll see things that got blocked, and then there'll be a little exclamation mark saying, this is in progress, but nobody's working on it because it's still blocked. And when it's resumed, you'll see a thumbs up sign. So, what I want you to notice here is that the first couple of weeks were chaotic. There was a lot of movement as people figured out which team they wanted to work on, who they wanted to work with, what the technologies were. Because remember, prior to introducing FAST, people had worked very much in silos. Each person had their area of expertise. They didn't really know anything about the other products in the company. But when we introduced FAST, we cut down the work in progress dramatically. Even though I would have preferred it to be smaller, we still went from dozens of things in progress to just no more than 8. And often it was closer to 5 or 6 valuable increments in progress. And we also focused the valuable increments so that they were much smaller. So now people had to work on things that were unfamiliar to them. And you see a lot of switching as a result. But then in the beginning, we did it literally every 2 days. And then fairly quickly, we went to 2 days a week. So after a couple of weeks, what you're going to see here is that people settled into their teams and they started switching really only because they were no longer needed on a team. Something got blocked or the work was finished. And for the most part, people would stay on their teams. What I also want you to notice is that they started delivering quite frequently. This was an organization that was only able to deliver every 2 or 3 months. And now they're delivering typically every week, often multiple times per week. Another thing that's interesting, now I do have more history, but it actually takes a lot of time for me to put this graph together. So this is where I stopped. And I don't know what happened here, but one thing I find interesting is that this team stayed together, they finished something, and then they all sort of went en masse all together into a new valuable increment, which I find really interesting. There was somebody else who came into it, but most of them stayed together. Now, these lines of people moving around, this represents intentional switching. There were also people going on holiday, joining the ops team, being on call for ops, which means you didn't have to be on a team. And I haven't shown those lines because that's a little more confusing. But for the most part, what you can see here is that teams tended to stay together. So overall, the thing that people are worried about with FAST is that because we have the opportunity to switch every couple of days, people are going to switch every couple of days. Turns out not to be true. We did see that in the beginning, but over time, the switching was genuinely because there was a need for it, not because people were arbitrarily switching teams. To sort of bring it all together, I would say that FAST worked really well, despite this was kind of being a worst case scenario for FAST. As I mentioned, there was a lot of siloed developers, a lot of unrelated products, product managers jockeying for position and power. They didn't have any team level coaching. They really needed help understanding how to work together in teams rather than individually, but they didn't have the budget to have me do it. They had a very thin engineering management layer, only one engineering manager for all these people. And she was really more interested in architectural work than how to work together as a team type of coaching work. But despite all of that, people were able to grasp it and do it fairly easily. It only took a couple of weeks for them to get into the swing of things and start working as teams. It did take them longer to start working as effectively as teams, but the actual fast part of joining teams, that was really easy to adopt. It's also really low overhead. Each fast meeting is only 20 minutes. And so we're looking at an overhead for fast of 40 minutes a week, which is amazing. That's really low for something that coordinates, everybody in the department all the time. And it worked. People did fluidly allocate to the work as needed. There was a lot of changes to the business priorities, and they just absorbed it without any trouble. On the downside, we did see that pressure to deliver every couple of days. I think that was mostly baggage from their previous sort of sprint-based approach. And also, there were some weird things going on with compensation in the organization. They had a lot of difficulty ramping up to unfamiliar work and difficulty working as collaborative teams. Again, I think that has more to do with the organizational baggage than with FAST itself, but it is something that you'd want to keep an eye on if you were to try this yourself. So I'm going to wrap up with a little bit more information. I want to talk briefly about idea flow. Even though this isn't fast specific, this is something that people often want to know about. When we say we're working on these valuable increments, where do they come from? Now, Fast says you should use Jeff Patton's story mapping, but my experience is that in any scaling environment, the idea flow that you need is specific to the environment, and this was no exception. So what we had here, Fast is a continuous flow system, also known as a Kanban system, which means we weren't using iterations or sprints. Instead, there's a continuous flow of work that's continuously being refined. There's the work that the Fast teams are doing, but there's also additional work going on to prepare work for the teams to work on. So it starts out with the portfolio product managers and executives. They're talking to stakeholders and understanding what's important. I turn that initial understanding into a draft purpose that's supposed to be updated every 6 months or so. And this is what one of the draft purposes looked like for this organization. It had vision, mission, indicators, and a context diagram showing who all the stakeholders were and how they interfaced with the teams, with the collective. They also build visual plans which show the valuable increments that the department could build and how they all fit together. And this is a real example of a visual plan for one of the many areas that this department was responsible for. And then, of course, they repeat that across multiple areas, all the areas that the department is responsible for. So this is what the visual plans for all of the areas looked like. And I have to remind you that there were only 24 engineers. So obviously, there are way too many areas, way too many valuable increments for them to finish any of them. Any one area could have taken them months. And if they had, I don't know, what is that, a dozen? But that was just, the nature of the organization. So because there's so much, the executives got together and decided which valuable increments the department was going to work on first. And they put that together in something called a Medusa diagram that combined all the top priorities from each area into a single prioritized list. So down here on the right, we have the top priorities for each area. And then on the left, we have the priorities that the department's going to work on. The idea was that they were going to spend about 50% of their time on their sponsors' priorities, 25% of the time on their departmental priorities, and 25% of the time on quick wins. Those are things that were easy and had high political value. And all of that was sort of brought together into this list of these are the things that we are going to prep to have the team work on. And this is what the collective is actually going to work on. So these things that are ready to go were brought into the FAST meeting in this ready to start column. And the work that was in progress was brought back to the Medusa diagram here. So that's how idea flow worked. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because we're almost out of time. But to summarize, everybody was working together to clarify purpose and context. That was supposed to be repeated every 6 months, 3 to 6 months. I'm not sure if it has been. And then simultaneously, there's people working on visual planning, prioritization, getting work ready, and actually doing the work in the FAST teams. The results of this were that the executives had total control over priorities. And it worked around the fact that they had way too many priorities. My contact called it poor strategic prioritization, which I think is accurate. It used to be that if a product manager had something urgent that needed to be done, they would sort of either do it themselves or go find an engineer and say, do this thing for me. That was greatly reduced. Became much easier to adjust priorities. And it was designed so that PMs would collaborate together. Although again, there was some jockeying for position. I'm not sure if that happened. The downside of this, though, was that it reduced engineer ownership, because the PMs were the ones talking to stakeholders now. Previously, the engineers had, a couple of products that they were responsible for, and they would go talk to the stakeholders along with the product managers. But now the engineers were working sort of in this pool, and all the talking was being done before it got to them. I think that's a flaw in the way we designed this, although it seemed necessary at the time. I think once work starts, it should be part of the FAST meeting. A product and engineering should self-select onto those teams and go do that work together. We also saw that some PMs struggled with following the rules, and the design did not address the root issue. I don't know that we could have addressed the root issue, but the root issue was that they have way, way too many products and responsibilities. That's my experience with FAST. What do I recommend? Well, I talked to my contact at this company just a couple of weeks ago. I stopped working with them in March, and we made arrangements for us to catch up 6 months later. And so I asked him, now that you've had the experience of doing this for 6 months, how did it work out? Was this a good thing? And here are the things that he told me that were on the plus side. They said that FAST has created a high degree of transparency. The whole department understands the body of work to be done. So executives know what's going on, but all the team members know what's going on as well. He said that we got very good just-in-time matching of work of people with work to be done, and we're able to change priorities. So as priorities change, people just join that. And that's something that I saw myself, is that the ability of FAST to have the right people working on the right thing at the right time is unparalleled. I've never seen anything like it. It is amazing how well people are able to work on what needs to be worked on. A pleasant surprise was one thing that they were really struggling with. Remember, they came from siloed backgrounds. They were struggling with, how do we work well as effectively as teams? Now, I haven't seen how that's changed, but my contact said they're pretty good at collaborating now. So I see that as a plus. It's not terribly surprising because they've had a lot of practice, and lots of time does tend to make things better, but I'm still glad to see that it got better. A pleasant surprise was, he said that when we started this, there was a real lack of engineering leadership, but having these stewards and limiting it to be just engineers, which is not sort of by the book fast, but we felt was necessary in the organization, has improved their engineering capability and engineering leadership in the organization. And something that was a big surprise was that they were planning on bringing in some full-time employees in India, not contractors, but actual members of the company. And that's a 12.5-hour time difference from the West Coast of the US, which is where these folks live, most of them. So I said, well, you probably just need to make a new FAST collective, have them work on their own. What they did was they had them join the actual existing FAST collective, come to the FAST meetings, which presumably meant they were staying up late or something, unfortunately. And they said that they just dived in. They were really eager to succeed. So they just self-selected into teams, and the teams brought them up to speed. I expected this to work well for bringing people on board when they're in the same time zone. I was very pleasantly surprised to hear it work out when you're talking about such a big time zone difference as well. On the downside, they have a lot of domains. So they weren't able to bring engineers into that initial conversation about what's going on. It decoupled the product management engineering, as I mentioned. Engineers weren't always able to work on the stuff that they wanted to work on because the number of things in flight were limited. And because there was so much stuff, they had difficulty sharing ownership and transferring knowledge. They also couldn't choose an area and really learn that well because there was just too much. Honestly, I think a lot of the things they identified as not working for them have to do with their strategic prioritization problems, not with FAST itself. But it is something to be aware of. So to conclude, FAST is a group of people who self-organize into teams on a frequent cadence. It makes it really easy to incorporate specialties such as user experience and have them work in the right things at the right time where they're needed. It's incredibly responsive to changing business needs. This organization was changing its priorities constantly, and FAST absorbed that without any trouble. It's very resilient to people joining and leaving. Collective ownership could be a challenge. Team dynamics could be an issue. Those are things that this organization struggled with. Sounds like they got better over time, but it's still something that the next time I do this, I'm going to keep an eye out for. And I suggest that you keep an eye out for as well. However, because people choose which teams they join, they do tend to work in teams that are functional rather than dysfunctional. And because there's the opportunity to leave a team, if you've got a dysfunctional relationship, it doesn't fester. People just move on. They go elsewhere. So if you were to try this yourself, I would recommend trying this. And the way I'm going to do this and the way I suggest you try it is just start with 2 teams that are closely related and willing to do this work. Teach them those collective ownership and collaboration skills if needed. Introduce FAST, combine those 2 teams, wait for the ripples to stabilize, and then assimilate more teams like the Borg from Star Trek, 3 to 5 people at a time, and stop when the collective just seems like it couldn't go any further. We were doing it with 45 people. There was plenty of room to grow from there. It's been done with 60 to 65 people. I don't know what the limit is. But once you do reach that limit, you can form new collectives and they can act as stream-aligned teams, and you won't need the enabling teams or the other features of something like team topologies because they can be big enough to truly have full ownership of a significant area of the product. So that's FAST. It is a way of scaling to larger teams by using self-selection and having multiple people act as a single large collective team. It is the most promising approach to scaling I've yet seen. It solves the problems of the horizontal scaling model that I've encountered, and I recommend that you give it a shot. I'll take questions, Stefan, if you wouldn't mind, and Usually there are a lot of questions about how fast works, so I'd be happy to go into more detail.
Okay, here comes the first one. What if there is a specific enabler that is common across the organization, has an impact that would be helpful for other downstream teams or component teams? In this case, how do we optimize the dependencies for value delivery?
Okay, so if we're talking about fast, what we're talking about is a vertical scaling model where all the skills you need are in one collective who forms into teams as they go. So in the horizontal scaling model, what you need is you need these enabling teams. You need these specialized teams because you have to sort of manage how do people coordinate. But in fast, that just happens automatically. This organization had 3 data scientists. Half of the remainder were visualization engineers, and the other half were data engineers. And so there were specialties in this environment. But as work needed visualization or data expertise or data science, ML type of work, people would just join those teams to do that work. So there was no need to say, these are the enablers in the organization, or this is the component. This is, I think, the major advantage of FAST over the horizontal scaling model, which is that you can dynamically switch between these different needs without having to create a complicated design.
Okay, next one. How did you make sure that the teams were equally filled?
We didn't. People, it wasn't necessary. You'll see, let's see if I can find a close up. As things got close to being done, typically the number of people that were needed on them would go down. Often it was just the product manager who was doing wrap up work. So as things finished, people would roll off the teams. Now, the guidance was don't start a new valuable increment unless there's nothing you can contribute to. So people would tend to roll into existing teams that were doing existing work rather than start new things. So you see here, this one was finished. So this person comes over here. This one was finished. In this case, they both started something new. But we allowed there to be 8 teams total. That was our work in progress limit. But as you can see, there was only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in this case. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They had all 8 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it was very fluid. It switched around. But the teams, when they needed a lot of engineering work, they tended to be full. As you can see here, there were 6 people on this team, 6 here, 4 here. It is something that just sort of worked itself out.
Okay, extension of the above. How do we ensure teams are populated based upon the correct business priority?
My experience is that engineers are pretty highly motivated to do good work for their organization, especially in this environment where it's very visible what everybody's working on. Actually, the problem wasn't how do we make sure people are working on stuff that's valuable to the organization, but how do we make sure that they're not overworking themselves? They felt a lot of pressure to deliver. And when things weren't, if they weren't able to finish everything they thought they could do in a value cycle, they put a lot of pressure and angst and stress on themselves as a result of that. So we actually had to go the other direction. We had to say, no, back off. The important thing is here that you're, especially in the beginning, that you're learning how to work together effectively. And yes, making progress on the business goals at the same time, but make sure you're also creating the conditions for success in the future. This has been my experience in a lot of organizations. There's sort of this common belief that people are naturally going to slack off, but I don't think that's warranted based on what I see in reality.
How do the developers focus and manage context switching if they keep changing frequently?
Well, again, they actually don't change that frequently. They will stay on the team until the work is done and then move to a new team. I did do some training for them about shared leadership. How do you bring new people into a team? What are the different kinds of leadership roles are needed on a team to make sure everybody is working effectively? They did struggle with that at first, but what I've heard in talking to them recently is that they've gotten pretty good at that.
Next one is an interesting one. How can this model be communicated to executives, etc., so that they will support this and know that what they want will be delivered?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to talk a little bit about idea flow. So you're talking about organizational change, which is really not unique to FAST. But how do you motivate organizational change? How do you get executive support? How do you get grassroots support? These are all things that you need. Just to plug my book a little bit, I spend a couple of chapters talking about it here. So you might want to check that out. In the second edition, there's a whole chapter on investing in change and also what you need to do to invest in agility in general. But in general, when I'm talking to people about what they can do to help their organization. I'm not talking about Agile or fast. I'm talking about the problems they're seeing and how we can address those problems. And because I come in from the outside, I'm hired by people who trust me to help with that. It's an easier sell for me because I already have that trust. But you have to build trust and then focus on what's their goals are and how you're going to solve them. If that's fast, great. And if not, that's fine too. Remember, we didn't think we were going to start out with fast. We created a horizontal scaling model, evaluated it, realized that it wasn't going to be a good fit for this organization, and only then went to the vertical fast model. And even then, the executives were pretty nervous, but one of the people on the change team who made this decision was a member of that executive team. And then another one was promoted into the executive team a little bit after we started. So they just sort of dragged them along.
Amazing how people were switching. Was there some knowledge transfer between the team members, pair programming, etc.?
Especially in the beginning, there was a lot of siloed knowledge. So typically it would be the team steward who would be the person who had a lot of knowledge in that area. Remember, you volunteer to be a steward, and you might expect everybody would rush to volunteer, but the opposite was true. People were uncomfortable volunteering to be stewards, at least in the beginning. So the people who would volunteer to steward a particular valuable increment were the people who had the most knowledge in that area. And they also decided how the team was going to work together. So if you're starting a new thing, they would start out by explaining, this is what we're working on, this is how it all fits together, and sort of bring people up to speed. And then as new people joined later on, which wasn't that frequent. Here's one that was fairly long running. You can see that only 2 people joined over the course of the week. Most of the people were stable. And if I were to zoom out, you see that that continues to be true. This was one of the things that had the most sort of specialized knowledge associated with it. And you'll see it also went on the longest. As people came in, they be paired up or given instruction on here's what you can work on. We also use something called discovery trees, which I don't have time to go into today, that were used to visualize the work that needed to be done. And as I mentioned, I did do shared leadership training with them to help them understand the different kinds of leadership that are needed on a team, including mentoring new team members and keeping things on track and making sure that people's voices were heard. These are all different forms of leadership. There's actually a great section in my book by Diana Larson that talks about team dynamics that I pulled that from. So that's how we did that. I imagine you have more questions, Stefan.
A quick one. How is performance measured? Team and individual?
If you're talking about an agile environment, measuring and managing based on individual performance will kill your productivity, because you're going to have people start working to the measure rather than working to what's best for the organization. Rather than using measurements, you need to use what's colloquially called management by walking around, evaluating subjectively rather than objectively on the part of the managers. I don't know how they did that in this organization. I do have a whole section on it in my book, though, if you want to know more. It's also called Theory X versus Theory Y management. It's not a quick one at all. Sorry, Stefan. And that's all I got to say. Thank you very much for your time. And I'll turn it back to you, Stefan.
James, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. That was truly amazing.
If anybody who feels like they want to know more, I've given longer versions of this presentation, and those can be found at my website, jamesshore.com.
James, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.